Brilliant, thank you very much. So, visual communication. A lot of people consider this to be a soft skill. Now, it's not. So I was talking to my friend Luca, in fact, just a couple of days ago, and he said that actually these things we called soft skills, we should be calling them core skills, because they're the skills that we really can't do without. And yet, because we think of them as soft skills, we kind of push them to the side and go, oh, no, must do Kubernetes. That's what Diana always likes to say. So, we're going to have a look at mastering visual communication, because that's just one element of communication. Right, so as I was introduced, I'm Jacqui Reed. I have written a book with O'Reilly called Communication Patterns. This talk is based on a small part of part 1, because I've worked out that I can't even run a workshop for part 1 in a whole day. So if you are interested in finding out more, if you have an O'Reilly subscription, you have access already. If you don't, there are bookmarks at the front here, and there's a few at the back as well. If you grab one of those, you get 30 days free. So you can read my book, of course, because I gave it to you. But there's loads of other books on there as well, and there are training courses, and I'm probably running a visual one coming up, if not another one. So grab those. And what I do is I kind of go into businesses and I help them by consulting this kind of thing, and I run training sessions. As I said, I do like day-long things, half-day workshops as well. But let's move on to what I want to talk about today. And the first thing here is we're talking about effective visual communication, because we can all communicate visually, but whether it actually makes sense and actually communicates what we want it to is the big question. And so when I'm talking to technical people, we all like patterns and anti-patterns, don't we? Because we understand these with our code. And so today I'm going to be talking about patterns and anti-patterns for visual communication, and that's how the book is set out as well. It's all patterns and anti-patterns. And if you have a look here, we've got ticks on one side, crosses on the other. I think you can probably tell which one means pattern, which one means anti-pattern. I probably don't need to explain that one. But we're going to look at how we can avoid various pitfalls and actually deliver impact with our diagrams. Now, the first thing I want to talk to you about is that style communicates. So if you look at these two diagrams, they have exactly the same content, but completely different style. Now, which one of these do you think is the more developed idea? Is it number 1 or number 2? Put your hands up if you think number 1's more developed. Number 2? Yes. But they're exactly the same. Okay? So what you can do is you can use style to visually communicate to your audience. And if you don't think about it, you are still communicating to them. If you don't think about it, you can give them completely the wrong message. So if you showed this one to your stakeholders very early on, they might say, oh, when does testing start? But actually, nothing's been implemented yet. I mean, this is just an idea. If you showed them that one, they might not get that idea. They might still get that idea because, you know, stakeholders are stakeholders. But if you showed your stakeholders this towards the end of a project, they might be sitting there going, oh, are we actually on track here? So I call this pattern meta style because it's on the same lines as metadata. You're giving people this subliminal information when you create your diagrams. So we want to use style to our advantage, and we want to avoid that miscommunication by using style that doesn't match what we actually intend. So another quick question here. Which of these styles is correct? This is a data flow diagram. It's a level 2, so we're getting quite into the details here. Should we use the sketch version or the more formal version? Hands up for number 1. 2. Most people went with 2. And the answer really here is it depends. So the reasoning for number 2, which you've all mostly gone with, is that, yes, we're getting into the details here, but what if it's just an idea? What if we actually are just thinking about this? then maybe number one might be the way to go. So it's all about context. Right, another pattern here. This one I call face in the crowd, also known as know your audience. So different audiences need different levels of detail and different types of diagram. I bet you all knew that already. You're thinking, wait a minute, I know this, why are you telling me this? But the problem is, we kind of forget it. We just kind of go, oh, I need to create a context diagram. I need to create this kind of diagram. And you just shove it all in, and then you don't think, actually, who's going to read my diagram in the end? So that's what you really need to think. And I've got a few questions you can ask yourself to help you with this. So the first is, what's their technical understanding? Now, you might find that a particular diagram is going to be seen by both business and technical. And in that case, you're really going to have to be quite clever with what you're putting in that diagram. Maybe you actually need 2 different diagrams, but you need to think about what each of those audiences actually need. So is your project manager very technical, very untechnical? Does your product owner want to know about the technical stuff, or do they really want to know how your choices are meeting their requirements? They don't really care if you're using Kafka or not. They don't know what that is. They don't care. So what's their technical understanding? What level of detail do they actually need? If you give someone a diagram which has lots and lots of different bits of detail on it, like maybe it's got all your security protocols on it, but they don't need it, then that's just going to confuse them. That's just adding extra detail that they need to learn to ignore. And if you're teaching people to learn to ignore things in your diagram, then good luck when you're trying to communicate something to them. So think about that. Then a big question here, what do they want from you? Okay, so they might know what they want, they might not know what they want. So you need to think about what their needs are, what are their concerns, what questions do you normally get asked by this particular stakeholder? And then the big one that people don't really think about, what do you want from them? Do you need them to sign off on a decision that you've made? Do you need them to make a decision based on what you're giving them? And you need to give them what they need to be able to fulfill that for you. So if you don't do that, you're not going to get what you need from them. So you don't get to sit back in my talks. Who is this for? We've got a UML class diagram. Just call out, who is this for? Whoa. I normally get like 1 or 2 people, like everybody was answering that. So I heard architects, I heard developers, I heard DBAs. I didn't hear what I normally get, which is no one, because it's UML. That is also a valid answer. So yes, this is for the people who are going to be looking at the data and architecting the data. This is not for people like your project manager. They're going to look at that and go, I don't know what you're talking about. What about this one? Who is this for? We've got a C4 context diagram, so this is very high level. Yep. Product, but this is for the kind of more businessy people, but it's also for the technical people as well. Because if you're a developer, you should have this context. Even if you're working in some kind of tiny service that is part of this box in the middle here, you should have this context. Even if you're not touching these bits, you should know who your customers are. You should know what you're interacting with. So this is for everybody. So that was a pattern. This one's an anti-pattern. And this one I call multi-story diagram, also known as mixing levels of abstraction. And now you might be thinking, oh, mixing levels of abstraction, that's kind of a sin in coding. We kind of split things out into modules or into layers. There's a couple of examples there. And we also do this in architecture. So the C4 model splits things out into different levels of abstraction. We also have architecture frameworks that do the same kind of thing. This is SABSA, which is a security framework. And so that's splitting this all out. And when we don't split it out, we get a diagram that's a bit like this. And the main problem with this is, if I can get this to work, is that if we look at this system in the middle, that's not broken down, but these ones are. And so we've got, at both ends of that arrow, we have different levels of abstraction. And so we don't really know what's talking to what. It could be anything. So what we do is we split it up. Here's the context diagram we saw earlier, and we've got the system in the middle there, and then that dark blue box gets broken down within this dotted box here. And we've got two diagrams, and people say to me, oh no, now I've got two diagrams to maintain. But I can tell you it's much easier to create and maintain two diagrams than it is to, first of all, answer all the questions you get asked about the diagram which isn't split up, and secondly, clear up all the mistakes that have been made because people didn't understand. So that's what we want to do. Mixing levels of abstraction causes confusion. So don't do it. You don't do it in your code, don't do it in your diagrams. Easy. Right, anti-pattern here. This one's called Explosion of Unicorns. Normally people's favourite. And I need a little prop here. It's a health and safety risk assessment. There we go. So you may have seen diagrams a bit like this. They don't have to be this bright, but there's just so many colours in it. They don't actually mean anything. It's just, oh, these are all separate things, so I'll colour them all separately. But you may as well be showing people this. It's very overwhelming, and if there isn't a reason for that colour, people will try and find a meaning for it because we search for patterns as human beings. So, here we go, I can take that off now. We can dial back the colours a bit, but the main thing I've done is reduce the number of colours here. I've also created a nice little key there, or a legend if you want to call it. But what I've done here is I've made it so that the colours actually have a meaning. What I could do here, if I didn't want to give any meaning to this, I could make it black and white. I know, shocking that. Or just choose one colour and make everything one colour. But that will say to people, right, there is no meaning to this colour. That's fine. But if there is meaning to the colour, you need to be very careful with that. The other thing to do is to make sure that you are not using lots and lots of colours. You can say, look, I've got a key. It's got 17 different colours in it. That's too much. That is a very high cognitive load for people to cope with. So don't do that. So the main things here are minimise the colour palette, as I've just said, and use colour to aid your communication. If there isn't a meaning for your colour, don't use it. Now, another anti-pattern. I apologise to anyone who doesn't like spiders, because this is probably a bit dramatic, but this one's all about unclear relationships. Now, I bet you've seen a diagram a bit like this many times, and little spiders there, finding itself at home. And these lines kind of cross over each other, the labels aren't clear, and that's not a particularly useful diagram. So there's a few things you can do here. So the first one is remove any unnecessary information. I said earlier you've got to think who's your audience. If they don't need that information, take it out. Put it in another diagram somewhere else. And that moves on to this next one. Split up the diagram if you have too much information in there. Like, say, if you've got some kind of logging service or some kind of security service or some database that everything's talking to, take that out of the diagram and create a diagram that's only for that particular service or database. And you can have that in the middle and then have nice lines and show what it connects to. So you've got two different diagrams. Right, another one. Minimize your line crossings and have really nice, obvious line jumps. So the line comes down, it has a nice big arc, and it goes like that, so it's going across the other one. Then we've got standardizing the position of the label. Now, if they're all over the place, it's much more difficult to see which line that label is for. I'm going to show you examples of these in a minute. And then the last one is using angled lines, which are usually called orthogonal, if you're looking in menus, to make your relationships clearer. And I'll show you an example here. Things like Draw.io, you can select that as an option for your lines, rather than just having the straight ones. So if you look here on the left-hand side, we have the sort of the new version, and on the right-hand side, we've got the old version. And you can see that the lines are much more easy to see. I'll show you the full version now. So we've got this untangled version, and I've actually managed to make it so that there's no lines crossing in this one at all. You can see the orthogonal lines. What you can do in most programs is drag the middle bit up or down so you can change the white space. It makes it much easier to look at. And what I've done is I've typically put the labels at the beginning of an arrow, like those two. But in this case here, I've put it in the middle of that one because there's no space at the beginning, and at the end of that one because there's no space at the beginning. So there's always going to be exceptions. Just make it really readable. So that's our nice untangle bit. Now this is a big message here. Diagrams are free. Create more than one. Don't just put everything into one. How many people here have seen one of those diagrams where it's just got everything in it and everything's about this big? Yeah, okay, most people. And you have to zoom in to see anything, and once you've zoomed in, you've lost all the context of the rest of it, so yes. So, diagrams are free, split up your diagrams. Right, an anti-pattern. This one's about colour as well. This one is colour is key, also known as relying on colour to communicate. Now, your turn again. Which one of these is yellow? I've simulated protanopia, which is a type of colour blindness. So, how many people think it's A, B, C, or D? Okay. Ah, there we go. Excellent. I'll talk about that a bit more in a minute. So, most people said D. In this case, it actually is D. What about this one? We'll look at this screen this time. So, how many people think that one of these is still yellow, but this is simulated tritanopia, another form of colour blindness? So how many people think it's E, F, G, H? Okay, I think about 6 people in total put their hands up for anything. It's actually E in this case. But you can see that it's not simple. You can't just say, oh, avoid red and green. That's not how colour blindness works. There's lots of different forms. So some people can see a colour a little bit. Some people can't see a colour at all. In rare cases, people have achromatopsia and they can't see any colour at all. And it's actually about 4.5% of the world's population that is colour vision deficient. And you may think that doesn't sound like very many people, but it's actually 1 in 12 men and 1 in 200 women, for reasons that I won't go into to do with X and Y chromosomes. I don't know if anyone understands it really. But there are, if you think about it, in our industry, we look around this room, and in the industry in general, have we got more men or more women? We've got more men. Therefore, in our industry, until that changes, you're more likely to come across someone who is colourblind, just because of numbers. And there's actually more than 350 million people worldwide, which is more than the population of the USA, and it's about half the population of Europe. Now, there are some tools that you can use for this. So if you're doing web work with your UIs, there are some built-in tools in things like Chrome and Firefox, I believe they both got them, or there are plugins which you can install so that you can simulate the different types and make sure that people can differentiate the colours in your user interface. So what you can do is you can take a palette. I just pulled these colours out of a picture which I quite liked. And then you can use a tool. There's loads of free ones out there. Some of them are online, some you can install, and you can simulate the different types. And so there's my standard palette, but when I simulate this, if you have a look there are lots of those simulations where those two colours are pretty indistinguishable. Even if there's a slight difference, you don't want to be peering at a diagram to try and work that out. And so one way to sort this out is to just go, okay, I'm going to take one of those colours out. Simple. If you do need more colours, you can then change the saturation of the colour. And so that's the lightness or darkness of it. And then the colours will look different, but then you're going to have to check it against all the other ones as well. So one of the things we can do is use a colourblind simulator. But when you're using software like, say, Draw.io or Visio, you might think, oh, the standard colour palette's in this. Surely someone's thought about this before and someone's checked it. Nope. So if you use some of the standard colours in Draw.io, and you've got Deuteranopia, then some of those colours look exactly the same. Basically, if you're using all pastels, don't. That doesn't work. But if we take some of the colours from my checked palette, we can see that when we simulate this, that those two colours, although they look completely different to the colours at the bottom, they look completely different from each other as well. So fail at the top, pass at the bottom. So don't rely on colour alone. Don't rely on your corporate or your software palette being colourblind friendly. Now I said colour is key. Look, this is fine. I've used a key. But how about when I put it in grayscale? Oh, they're the same colour. So this is actually a tip here. If you do not have time to check your palette with all the different types, check it with grayscale, because if you can't differentiate easily in grayscale, somebody will be having a problem. So if you do nothing else, check it in grayscale. But if we don't have time to check our palettes, we can use pattern instead. You just need to make sure that it's the contrast on the pattern and the background colour is enough for people to be able to see that pattern. You can also use symbols. I've seen plenty of people use just a red border or a green border to show the difference between something bad and something good. And of course, it's exactly the same border, and if people can't distinguish those two colours, they don't know which one's which. So you can use symbols with or without the colour. So here we've got lots of things you can do. So we're going to use patterns, we're going to use symbols, we're going to use labels along with a colour, or throw colour out, use black and white. We can also choose those colours with the different saturation levels, which I mentioned. Then we can use those simulation tools, loads of free ones. Once you've developed one or two palettes, then you're set, aren't you? You don't need to do it every time. We're going to consider monitor and projector color calibration. So we had a really good example of that before. And in fact, I've given this talk where the projector gave it quite a yellow tinge as well. So we need to consider that when we're talking about things. Because if you say, oh yes, the lime box, and everyone's like, well, there's a brown one, and there's a green one, and there's a yellow one, but yes. So consider that. And then also consider if your diagram's going to be in grayscale. And you may think, oh, what's put in grayscale these days? If you ever write a book, you will discover that the publisher goes, no, we're not going to publish that in colour. And so every single diagram in my book, I had to make sure that it showed correctly in grayscale. It was great fun. Right, on to another pattern now. This one is called written in legend, also known as use a key or a legend. This one's the thing you're told to do this in school, aren't you? Always use a key, but we never actually do. So don't rely on your audience having specific knowledge. I talk about this more in the book when I'm talking about icons. How many people here have seen like AWS or Azure icons, and it's just the icon? It doesn't even name the service. The other thing you can consider, which I was talking to another speaker about the other day, is that if you're showing these icons, actually just having the name of the service underneath it, if I don't, I use Azure. So if I see an Azure icon and you're talking to me about things, I actually kind of want to know what it is. So is it a queue? Is it a database? Because if you think about it, all these cloud providers, they have all these funky names for stuff. It doesn't tell you actually what it is. So consider that too. And so what we're trying to do here is we're making this a balancing act. Now, if you have a look at this photo, we've got use my other pointer here. There we go. So we've got a ramp here. So anyone who needs that ramp can go up that ramp. But there's also some stairs up this side here. So if you're trying to get over here, it's probably quicker, and if you can use the stairs, you can get to there quicker. So it's this kind of balancing act between giving the people without the knowledge the information they need to understand, but also not getting in the way of the people who already have the knowledge. And I'll show you some ways to think about this. So, domain storytelling, I've seen this talked about by other people, so you may have seen this already, but this is using icons. And you think, well, I chose these icons, it's really obvious. And we do this with other types of icons as well. But if we can have a key, then we're just making sure that everybody is on the same page and understands. The main thing here is to not leave it open to interpretation, because if you show a diagram to, say, you've got an overall diagram for several teams, those teams could all go off and implement something completely different that does not integrate if they don't get the same message. UML, everyone knows UML, don't they? No, I don't think people ever really did know UML. So I think everybody always needs this key because it's got so many little finicky little bits in it. But now we've made this a bit, there's too much information on here now. So ramps and steps, we can just, use the other one again, there we go. So we can just include that specialization bit because that's all we need here. So that reduces the amount of information. Or we can, if we're embedding this in some kind of web page or similar, you can say, right, here's the key for anyone who needs it. And maybe that opens a new window, maybe it pops out, up to you. But we're helping the people who need it, not getting in other people's way. C4, Simon Brown says you should use a key. This, you might look at this and go, oh, it's really obvious. Look, it looks like a browser. Look, that's obviously a data store, but some people will not know that. So include that key. Now, with all software architecture, we need to be limiting our assumptions. If you have assumptions, you write them down and you get them signed off. At least I hope you do. So don't assume that people have an understanding when they look at your diagrams. Right. Another anti-pattern. You'll probably quite like this one. MLAH, also known as multiple letter acronym hell. Yes, we know this one, don't we? So the big message here, only use defined acronyms. And there's a few ways you can do this. So if you are speaking to people, you can say both of them. Don't just tell them the non-acronym. Say AKA, also known as, because then people actually get to learn what the acronym means. If you only go also known as, because I don't think you know the acronym, then someone else says AKA, they don't know they're the same thing. So always say both. If you're writing, depending on how long that writing is, you will need to define it at least once at the beginning. If it's in a diagram, if you're saving space in your diagram by using an acronym, then put it in the key. As long as that key is included in the diagram and not a separate one, because if that gets separated, then it gets lost. You've also got glossaries as well. So, little game here. What does DRY stand for? Don't repeat. And ironically, you just all did, all across the room. So that one is don't repeat yourself. What about DFD? Data flow diagram. You had a bit of a clue earlier, we've used them. SPA. Everybody knows that one. BLT. Yes. Bacon, lettuce, and tomato. See, this works everywhere in whatever language people know BLT. Or is it business leadership team? Basic language translator? Bulk loading tool? Be like that. You get the point. It could mean lots of different things. And acronyms mean different things to different people. Even if people have grown up together, gone to the same school, university, gone into the same company, there's differences. The knowing an acronym can be the difference between watching Netflix and watching Disney+. They have different content, and so you pick up different things. I don't watch either of those, by the way. So I don't know any of the acronyms. I have to look up stuff all the time when people say it. So it's easy to fall into thinking that others have the same understanding as you, because in your brain, things make sense. Well, okay, most of the time, things in your brain make sense, but other people have completely different understandings to you. So next time you use an acronym, think SIDI, which stands for state it, define it. Yes, I'm being silly. I'm not trying to make up a new acronym, but at least I did just follow it. So that's the thing. State it, define it. Right, I've got another pattern for you now. This one I call a push in the right direction, also known as, AKA, match the diagram flow to expectations. Now, this is an interesting one. So all diagrams have some kind of flow of information in them. If you look at this diagram, when it was put together, no kind of thought was put into how it was going to be read. So in English, we start in the top left and finish in the bottom right. But this diagram starts here. Isn't that useful? So if we match that flow to the expectation, we get this diagram. Because look, that starts on the left. And then we have our requests going from left to right, and the responses from right to left. And having that means that people get this nice, easy understanding. If you stick to the same pattern throughout your diagram, it makes it much easier for people to understand. Now, when it comes to sequence diagrams, these are a lot easier to get right. But how many people have seen these sequence diagrams, but then they go kind of over there, over there, over there, through that one, and all the way over here? So with sequence diagrams, it's all about getting all these items in the right order. If you get them you're not always going to be able to get lovely lines like this, but change the order, try and get it so they don't particularly cross over each other. That's the way to do it. So the big thing here is we're considering who our audience is, but also how they're going to read the diagram. We don't want to be jumping all over the place. But some of you are thinking, wait a minute, I've got diagrams, I don't have time to redo them all, and maybe I don't even have the original diagram to be able to change. I don't want to recreate it. So there's a few things you can do. You can have a kind of big arrow, a kind of you are here, start here, like you get on maps when you're at theme parks and things. You can also use numbers and go, right, here's number 1, number 2, number 3, number 4, number 5. And so you can guide people through your diagram like that. If you're presenting, you can show and hide parts of the diagram as you go. So that's the way to sort out. I'm sure it was somebody else who put that diagram together. It wasn't you, okay? So forgive that person. Right, this one is named after Gregor Hope's book, in which he talks about a pirate ship. So, show them the pirate ship. We're going to enthrall people with context. Now we've got our nice scene here, our context. And in the book, Gregor has a good quote about Lego, which we all like, of course. So he says, when you look at the cover of a box of Legos, you don't see a picture of each individual brick that's inside. Instead, you see the picture of an exciting, fully assembled model positioned in a lifelike Pirate's Bay with cliffs and sharks. And you may be saying, but I'm not creating diagrams for children. Or you may be thinking, I am creating diagrams for children. It depends who you work with. But this works for everyone. It's not just about children. It's about giving people that impression and context. So this might be what you really want to talk about in your meeting. But this is right down in the weeds. How about we start with the next level up data flow diagram? And we can start with that one and move on to the second one, because we're giving people that context. But actually, that's probably not where you want to start either. How about a C4 context diagram, or any boxes and lines context diagram that you have? And then we can move through and create this narrative for people. Now, how long you spend at each of these stages will depend on how much knowledge people have. Maybe you go through the first two really quickly, a bit more time on number 3, lots of time on number 4. Or maybe you're introducing something to people, so you do need to spend more time at the top level. But don't try and skip, because if people misunderstand what you're talking about, you're going to get errors in code. People say, what gets deployed to production is your developer's misunderstanding of what is supposed to be done. So one thing you can do is line up all your diagrams or artifacts and just see if there are any narrative gaps in there. And then you can create those before you kind of fall into that gap and have lots of questions. Right, another anti-pattern, UML, or not so unified modeling language. So also known as UML when it's not useful. So UML can be useful, but in limited contexts. So UML diagrams are split into 2 types, structural and behavioral. And you probably didn't know that there's actually this many UML diagram types out there, because we only tend to use a few of them, if any at all, but there are some businesses that require everything to be done in UML. But what we really need to do is think about, what does our audience need? Going back to that audience again. So in my development and architecture career, I have made one UML component diagram, and it is this one. Thank goodness, because it took forever to put together. It's ridiculously complicated. And how long until that goes out of, trying to think of the word, out of date. My brain's not working this late at the day. So we want to keep it simple and straightforward. That same diagram can be done in C4. And then even if we forget to put that key in, people can understand. UML sequence diagrams traditionally have lots of detail, maybe even method calls in them. I should have got to this slide earlier because it would have told me what I wanted to try and remember. So how long until it's out of date? So we can use sequence diagrams, but just simplify them. Don't put those implementation details in, and then you won't have to update them as often. So we basically want to use UML for good reason. And if you can't find a good reason to use it, don't use it. Right. We have time for one more. So this one I call structures behaving badly, also known as mixing structure and behavior. Now I said that there were 2 different types of diagram, structural and behavioral. But if we mix these in one diagram, it can get very confusing. So here is just a boxes and lines diagram. It's got a lot of information in there, and we don't necessarily want all that information or want it together because it becomes confusing. So what we can do is we can pull that information out and just say, right, this is just a structure. This is our structural diagram. And then there's lots of types of diagram you can use for behavior, including the data flow diagrams. There's sequence diagrams as well, things like that. So what we're doing here is we are applying the single responsibility to diagrams. And actually, you will find that there's lots of principles that you apply to code that you can apply in other areas of software architecture and communication, and they do really work. Right. Okay, I've got time for one more. This is the last one now. So this one I call connect the dots. And this is quite an important one, really, because this is all about, I've just told you to split your diagrams up, but we need to be able to navigate between those diagrams to understand everything now because it's split up. So navigating between those levels of abstraction must be easy. Now, some notations help us with this. With C4, I've shown you these two diagrams. We have the dark blue box. I'm going to point to it. The one in the middle there, that is represented by this dotted box with exactly the same label in it on this diagram. And so whichever of these diagrams you see first, you can link it with the other one. You can also use referencing. So in data flow diagrams, you will see that we have these numbers. And so you can see that in the higher level, we have a number 2, and in the lower level, we have a 2.1, 2.2, and 2.3. We can connect them together. We also have the data stores, and they are labeled the same in each diagram. Please make sure that you actually use the same labels in each diagram. If you say one of those is A in one diagram and D in the other, you're just going to confuse people. So get those labels the same, then people will be able to see this. So we're going to make explicit references to other levels of abstraction. We're not just going to let people kind of surf around in between everything. So I said that I've got the bookmarks for you. Also, there's a few free resources on the book website, as well as if you're interested in getting a copy, there's the different places you can get it. But if you're interested in ADRs, architecture decision records, there are some free templates on there as well. So I want to say thank you very much, and I'm happy to take any questions now or if you catch me afterwards. So thank you.